I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. It was a Thursday night, the kind that smells like stale coffee and rain on asphalt. I had ducked into the little 24-hour cafe near my apartment, the one with flickering neon and chairs that always squeaked if you leaned back too far. She was already there, perched at the counter like she belonged to it, not the people bustling around. I order my usual black coffee, no sugar, and try not to stare. She caught me anyway, halfway through adjusting the sleeve of her cardigan. Her eyes lingered on me, just long enough that I felt a flutter I didn't know how to name. "You're late tonight," she said, not looking accusatory, just noticing. "I got held up," I muttered, tucking my hands into the sleeves of my hoodie. I felt small under her gaze, though she didn't tower. She just carried a quiet gravity, like the world had slowed down for her to step through it. She smiled faintly, a small tilt of her lips that made the corners of her eyes crease just so. I noticed the way her hands fiddled with the edge of a napkin, rolling it between her fingers almost absently. It was stupid, but I imagined what it would feel like if I could touch her hands, so mundane and yet so impossible. "Same as always?" she asked. Her voice carried that soft lilt I'd heard before, the one I could replay in my head when the apartment felt too empty. "Yeah, same." My words felt clumsy. I wanted to ask her about the book she had next to her coffee cup, but the thought got stuck. I'd end up saying something dumb, like I always did. She glanced at the pages, then back at me, and for a moment we shared a silence that wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, filled with something neither of us named. I took a slow sip of my coffee, tried to make my posture casual, even though my chest was too tight. I came here a lot, I realized, not because of the coffee. Not just because it was warm and quiet when the streets outside were soaked with rain. I came because she existed in this corner of the world, unclaimed by anyone I knew. I imagined her at home, probably finishing laundry or scrolling through some old text messages, and it struck me how little I knew about her life. She was my friend's mom, yes, but that didn't stop my mind from wandering to the space between us, the tiny, unspoken moments we carved out in these brief, accidental meetings. "Do you want a refill?" she asked suddenly, a small tilt of her head that suggested she didn't need an answer, but wanted one anyway. I hesitated. "Sure, thanks," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I felt. She leaned back on her stool, and I noticed the faint scent of vanilla mixed with something darker, maybe old books or night air trapped in her hair. I looked down at my cup and pretended to check my phone, fingers brushing the edge of the screen that held 3 unsent texts to friends I hadn't seen in weeks. Nothing important, just things I want to say but couldn't, things that piled up quietly in my chest. Her eyes flicked toward me briefly, just a glance, and it made me flinch in a way I couldn't explain. Then she stood, coffee in hand, bag slung over her shoulder. "I should go," she said and paused. "Tomorrow night." I blinked. That pause, the hesitation in her voice, was a spark I couldn't ignore. I nodded before I thought about it. "Yeah, tomorrow." She walked away slowly, and I watched until the door clicked behind her. The neon buzzed above me, the rain still tapping against the windows. I folded my napkin neatly, like I always did, though it felt pointless. And then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Don't forget tonight." I stared at it too long and didn't reply. The next night, I found her in the same cafe, though this time the lights felt warmer, somehow softer, as if they were waiting for her. She waved me over before I even ordered, and I slid into the stool beside her, trying not to let my fingers linger too long on the counter. "You made it," she said, not accusing, just noticing. There was a trace of relief in her voice, like she'd been holding her own hesitation at bay. "Yeah, I didn't want to miss it," I said. The words sounded too eager even to me, so I took a sip of my tea instead, the warmth creeping in my palms. She smiled faintly and stirred her own cup, the spoon scraping gently against porcelain. "I was thinking about the garden and my old apartment," she said suddenly, almost to herself. "There was this patch of lavender I used to water every morning. My ex used to joke that I loved the plants more than him." I swallowed and nodded, pretending not to notice the subtle weight behind her joke. Divorced, I realized. Older. fragile in ways I hadn't let myself consider before. "That's nice," I said softly. "Lavender smells like quiet afternoons." My words sounded empty even to me, but she tilted her head, listening. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger, slow, deliberate. I used to come home after work and just sit there, smelling it. Felt like the world slowed down, you know. I nodded again, imagining her in that small apartment, curling up with sunlight and plants, alone in the hush of evening. I thought about the risk of what I was feeling, about my friend, about the impossible distance between our lives. But still, I wanted to reach across it. We sipped our tea in silence for a while, letting the sound of the spoon against porcelain fill the space. I wanted to speak, but every word felt like it might betray something I wasn't ready to own. Then, she laughed quietly at something on the counter, a tiny dry laugh that made the air shift as if the moment itself exhaled. "You always look like you're solving a mystery in your head," she said, half joking, half observing. "I'm thinking," I said, shrugging. My gaze flicked to her hands, folded neatly on the counter. I imagined what it would feel like to brush them, to feel her warmth. My chest tightened. She leaned slightly closer, and I caught the faint scent of vanilla again, and something else I couldn't name. "You're different from the boys my friends know," she said quietly, as if testing the waters. "I mean, you listen, not just the words." I looked down at my tea, fidgeting with the handle. I wanted to tell her everything, how empty the apartment felt, how long I stared at my phone hoping for a text, how every small gesture from her spun in my head. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the sugar packet she'd left on the counter and handed it to her, our fingers brushing lightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, she held my gaze just for a moment longer than necessary and smiled that small, almost secretive smile. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I caught her at the grocery store the next evening, by accident, or maybe not. I was hovering near the coffee aisle, pretending to compare brands, when I saw her pushing a cart like it weighed nothing, her posture perfect even under fluorescent lights. "Hey," I said, too casual. My voice cracked slightly. She turned, surprised, her eyes softening for a second. "Oh, hey," she said, then paused as if measuring how much space to give me. The pause stretched, and I realized she was deciding whether to step closer or step back. I followed her down the aisle at a careful distance, the sound of our carts scraping against the floor loud enough to fill the quiet spaces between us. I wanted to reach for her hand, just once, but I froze. My fingers itched. "You didn't tell me your friend's coming by tomorrow," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, scanning a shelf of tea. Her tone was neutral, but something in the pause told me she was testing boundaries. Yeah, I forgot," I said. I felt heat rise in my chest. I wanted to say more, about wanting her, about the tension that had been building, but the words dissolved before they formed. She picked up a box of tea, rolled it in her hands, and sighed quietly. Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at the floor, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I wanted to step closer, to bridge the unspoken gap, but my own hesitation pinned me. I imagined what it would feel like if no one else existed. If we could just touch. Her hair brushing my arm, her breath close enough to catch. And then the aisle ended too soon, and the moment snapped back into fluorescent reality. A friend of hers appeared, waving from across the store. She stiffened, said a quick hello, and suddenly the warmth between us felt like a thin thread stretched too tight. I said nothing, just followed her eyes until she returned the box to the shelf and turned away, her back rigid. We left the store together, walking side by side, but not touching. My hands twitched in my hoodie pockets, longing for contact. She kept glancing at me, but her lips were tight, her jaw set. I wanted her to pull me close, to let the rest of the world disappear, but the distance remained deliberate, careful. Later, we found ourselves at the corner cafe again. She ordered a tea. I sat opposite her, elbows resting lightly on the table. I wanted to lean across, to whisper something foolish, but my throat tightened. I watched her stir the cup slowly, her eyes tracing the rim, flicking to me and away, over and over. I imagined the brush of her fingers, the tilt of her head, the faint scent of vanilla in her hair. We were close enough that our knees almost touched under the table. I thought of saying it all, letting words tumble out, but I didn't. Not yet. She looked up at me, eyes hesitant, lips parting just slightly, and for a fraction of a second the air between us shifted. My heart thumped so loud I thought she might hear it. The pause held, delicate, dangerous. And then, the moment ended. She smiled softly, a little too quickly, and I realized we had almost crossed the line. I wanted to reach for her hand, just once, but I let it go. We ended up on the park bench by the river, the city lights reflecting off the water in soft streaks. It was late, later than usual, and the air smelled like damp concrete and something faintly floral, her perfume, or the wind carrying memory. I wanted to say something, anything, but my hands rested on my knees, still, and my mouth felt heavy. She leaned back, eyes tracing the ripples on the water, lips pressed lightly together. She started, then stopped, looked at me, blinked. "It's stupid," she said finally, almost too quiet to hear. "What is?" I asked, though my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. She twisted her ring around her finger, just one hand, and I realized how small it made her look. Vulnerable, and yet impossibly alive. "Seeing you here, with me, it shouldn't feel like this." Her words hung between us, heavy with things unsaid. My age, her divorce, the impossible risk of us. I imagined every consequence, every quiet voice of guilt in my head, but it didn't stop the pulse in my chest. I started but stopped too. The words dissolved. I wanted to tell her I'd been thinking about her constantly, that even now I could feel her in my bones, that even the smallest brush of her hand or glance haunted me, but it felt reckless to speak it. She shifted closer, almost imperceptibly. My breath caught. I wanted to lean in, to close the gap, but my body froze. "You make it hard," she said finally, voice low, more to herself than to me. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for permission or a sign I could never give. I imagined her at home, laughing with my friend, the world thinking she was just a mom in her 40s. And I wanted her to know how little the world mattered right then. How much I wanted her. I noticed her hand brush against mine lightly. Accidental or deliberate, I couldn't tell. My fingers itched to respond, but I let them stay put, hovering over empty space. The silence between us became a kind of confession, rawer than any words. I don't know how to stop feeling this," she said, almost a whisper, eyes dropping to the hem of her sweater. I could hear the catch in her voice, the tremor she tried to hide. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her it was okay, that I felt it too, but saying it aloud might ruin the fragile hold we had on this moment. So I stayed quiet, letting the night carry everything we couldn't. We sat there, the city breathing around us, the river flowing like time we weren't allowed to touch. And I realized that everything, my restraint, her hesitation, the way our hands hovered too close, had led to this fragile, dangerous calm. She looked at me again, the question unspoken but clear. Do we let this end with a whisper, or cross the line we both know is there? The week after the park bench, she stopped answering my texts as quickly. Not completely, just enough to make me notice. I would send a message, reread it 3 times, delete it, then send a shorter one. Her replies came late, clipped, polite, as if she were measuring the air between us before breathing. I try not to read too much into it, but every pause felt heavy. I imagined her at home, maybe telling herself she couldn't, maybe wondering if I would wait. I couldn't stop myself from waiting. Then I saw her by chance at the cafe, but she wasn't alone. A young man, tall, laughing. He touched her arm the way she had touched mine. Not exactly the same, but close enough to make my stomach twist. I turned away, pretending to examine the menu, though I wasn't hungry. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the image. The easy laughter, the tilt of her head, the way she didn't notice me watching. I tried to write a message, just something casual, but I deleted it halfway. My phone stayed on the table, buzzing softly with reminders I ignored. A few days later, I showed up at the cafe again, and she wasn't there. Not her usual corner, not the counter. I sat anyway, my knees tucked under the table, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup. Every person who walked past my table made me think it was her. Each disappointment was small, quiet, sharp. I imagined she was busy. Maybe it wasn't me. But the small, quiet hope I'd been clinging to, her glance, the brush of hands, was fading, replaced with something unnameable, like static before storm. I thought about our bench by the river, the way she had almost admitted something, the pause between us like a door cracked open. And now it felt like the door had shut without warning. I wanted to call. I wanted to show up at her apartment. I wanted answers, but my chest felt hollow with the realization that some questions might not have answers. Instead, I sat there, watching the clock tick, the world moving around me, and I tried to remember what hope felt like. Tried to remind myself that there had been small, beautiful moments between us. Her hand brushing mine, the half laugh she gave when I looked awkward, the smell of her hair that lingered in my hoodie long after the cafe. But everything had shifted. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I typed a message to her, erased it, typed another, and then left the phone face down on the table. A chair remained empty beside me, though I hadn't known anyone would sit there. The cafe hummed around me, strangers' laughter spilling into the quiet I couldn't fill. I left eventually, walking the streets alone, imagining her laughter echoing somewhere else, and wondering if I would ever feel seen in the same way again. The world went on. The rain softened, the neon buzzed, and I kept walking, the sentence unfinished, the pause stretching like a shadow I couldn't shake. She opened the door before I could knock properly. The hallway smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, and for a second I froze, the words I'd rehearsed dying on my tongue. "Hey," she said, shifting her weight, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Her eyes caught mine, and I saw the hesitation mirrored there, careful, fragile, like she was measuring if the world could bear this moment. "Hey," I said, voice low. I wanted to step in, to collapse into the space between us, but I hesitated. Every fiber of me wanted to reach out. Every thought warned me to stay back. I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted, eyes dropping. The words weren't dramatic, just real, simple, small, honest. I had to, I said. My hands twitched to my sides. The air felt thick, almost tangible, like we were both holding on to something too heavy to put down. We moved into the kitchen, neither of us speaking, just the soft scrape of our shoes against the tile. She set a cup of tea on the counter, and I leaned lightly against it, the warmth radiating in contrast to the cold I'd been carrying for days. "I thought maybe it was easier if we didn't," she said, voice catching slightly. She glanced up at me, eyes bright with unspoken questions. "If we stayed," her words trailed, unfinished, and I felt the gravity of everything we hadn't said press into my chest. I looked at her hands, folded loosely around the cup. "I thought about it too," I said finally, a voice almost a whisper. "About you. About us." Her lips parted, and for a fraction of a second the world tilted. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but I let the moment breathe, letting the words be enough. She nodded slightly, like she understood without needing confirmation. We stood there in silence for a long beat, the kind that carries everything. No declarations, no promises, just acknowledgement of what was real, fragile, and ours to hold or lose. "You don't have to," I said, almost to myself, almost to let her retreat. But her eyes didn't move. She didn't step back. Instead, she gave me the smallest smile. Not a flourish, not a reassurance. Just a human connection that said, okay. That said, we exist here in this tiny, quiet moment together, even if nothing else changes. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hand brushed the counter near hers, close enough to feel the warmth. That was enough. She picked up her cup again and sipped, and I leaned against the counter, watching the steam curl between us. The tension was still there, raw and real, but lighter somehow. Something had shifted, even if only slightly. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't need to. For now, the pause felt like choice, and the small, shared presence, soft, honest, unspoken, was enough. It was 8:47 a.m., and the cafe smelled like warm bread and black coffee. She was already there, sitting in the corner by the window, the bench we'd claimed months ago, now feeling like ours, even if no one had ever said it out loud. I slid into the seat across from her, hands wrapped around my cup, noticing how the steam curled the same way it had the first night I'd come here. She looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips, and for a moment, the city outside ceased to matter. "You took your time," she said, voice teasing but soft. I shrugged, letting the warmth of her presence fill the space. "I wanted to make sure I didn't ruin it," I admitted, eyes tracing the rim of my cup, remembering all the pauses, all the words left unsaid. She didn't laugh, didn't scold. She just nodded, and that was enough. We drank quietly, the way we had learned to, letting the silence speak. No need for grand declarations, no urgent confessions, just the comfort of a shared routine. Black coffee for me, tea for her, the occasional glance or half-smile that said everything we had learned without saying it. The river bench had been replaced by this cafe table, the park replaced by sidewalks and morning traffic, but the feeling lingered, slow, deliberate, earned. The tension that had once hummed between us had softened into something steadier, something that felt like home. She reached across to adjust the sugar in my cup, just enough to touch my fingers. I didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it held all the quiet warmth we had carried through months of hesitation, longing, and risk. "I've missed this," she said, voice low, as if admitting it made it real. "Me too," I said, and it felt heavier than any confession ever could, because it didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be dramatic. It just was. The cafe filled with morning chatter, the clinking of cups, the buzz of the neon sign outside. And for the first time in a long while, I felt untethered from the waiting, the doubt, the near misses. The small, deliberate patience we'd practiced had carried us here. We lingered until the coffee cooled, talking about nothing important. A new book she'd picked up, the rain forecast for tomorrow, a joke someone had texted me. Every word ordinary, every gesture ordinary, but together it felt extraordinary in its quietness. When we finally stepped outside, the sun was just spilling over the buildings, painting everything gold. We walked side by side, neither reaching for the other, but close enough that the space between us was comfortable. And I realized, as I inhaled the morning air mixed with her scent, that love didn't need a flourish or a declaration. It could be in the bench we'd claimed, in the cups of coffee, in the pauses that spoke louder than words. I didn't need more than that. And somehow, that was everything. Because only we would understand why a black coffee at 8:47 a.m. could mean more than 1,000 words ever could.